Good evening, my friends. I hope this message reaches you in a quiet hour because what you're about to hear is not just a political headline. It's a heartbeat. A sound rising from the red earth of Africa, steady, defiant, alive. It didn't begin with a handshake. It began with thunder. When former South African President Jacob Zuma stepped off that plane in Wagadugu, the capital of Burkina Faso, the air itself seemed to pause. This was not another diplomatic courtesy call. This was a signal, a spark sent through the veins of a continent that has waited too long to speak in its own voice. For decades, Africa was told to wait. Wait for approval. Wait for aid. Wait for permission from the very hands that once drew her borders. But tonight, those borders are trembling because under the young, unyielding leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has chosen a different word: enough. They walked away from ECOWAS. They joined hands with Mali and Niger to form a new pact, the Alliance of Sahel States. And in doing so, they declared to the world, "We take orders from no one." To some in the international community, it sounded reckless. To millions of Africans, it sounded like freedom. When Zuma's plane touched Burkinab soil, it wasn't coincidence. It was symbolism turned to flesh. A veteran of the anti-apartheid struggle walking beside a soldier of a new generation. The old lion meeting the young. And for a moment, it felt as though time itself had folded the past, shaking hands with the future. The streets of Wagadugu were alive before dawn. Drums pounded like 1,000 hearts. Women danced barefoot on the dust. Children waved flags of red, green, and gold, the colors of a continent that refuses to die quietly. And through it all, one phrase echoed through the crowd, simple yet unshakable. Africa for Africans. To the people, Zuma was not a politician. He was a memory, a survivor of both triumph and disgrace, standing now as a witness to rebirth. And beside him stood Ibrahim Traoré, the 6-year-old captain who turned defiance into destiny. When their hands met on the palace steps, it wasn't a staged photo. It was respect, unspoken, unforced. Two men, two generations, one conviction. Africa must decide her own future. Behind the ceremony, a deeper movement was already unfolding. Burkina Faso's withdrawal from ECOWAS had sent shockwaves through diplomatic corridors from Paris to Washington. Western analysts called it dangerous. They warned of sanctions, of collapse, of isolation. But in Wagadugu, people didn't hear fear, they heard liberation. The newly formed alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger wasn't just about military defense. It was about economic sovereignty. It was about reclaiming what had always been Africa's, her land, her gold, her dignity. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso began refining its own gold. Not shipping it away for foreign corporations to profit from. Not begging for fair terms. But building wealth within. Profits redirected to schools, hospitals, and rural power grids. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And that progress was born of defiance. Later that afternoon, Zuma visited a newly built refinery in Wagadugu. He stood before young engineers, their hands stained not with coal or oil, but with purpose. He looked at them and said, "We once dug for gold to survive, now you refine it to build." The crowd erupted. But what lingered wasn't applause, it was realization. Something irreversible had begun. Across Africa, from Accra to Johannesburg, people were whispering, could this be the beginning of a new era? Is the dream of Sankara, Nkrumah, and Lumumba breathing again? For many, Zuma's visit was more than diplomacy. It was validation. An elder telling a new generation, you are not alone. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, thousands gathered in Independence Square. The anthem rose. The crowd fell silent. And then Zuma lifted his fist not in anger, but in remembrance. In that moment, the ghosts of Sankara and Mandela seemed to walk among the living. History wasn't being remembered. It was being resurrected. But the story didn't end in the square. It continued the next day, in a conference hall filled with faces from across the world. The Afro Descendants Conference, held in Wagadugu, October 2025. Nearly 700 people from the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, all gathered under one banner. Reclaiming the future. The Burkinab government had sent out a simple message. Africa wants you back. When Zuma stepped to the podium, the hall fell into a silence so thick it felt sacred. He spoke slowly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You are not guests," he said. "You are home." The words detonated like thunder. Tears fell. People rose. And in that eruption of emotion, something ancient awoke. A woman from Brazil wept into her hands. A man from Jamaica shouted, "Finally!" And across the ocean, millions watched in Harlem, in Port-au-Prince, in London, whispering, "We are home." Social media exploded. The hashtag number AfricUnited surged across timelines. For once, unity wasn't a speech, it was a movement. But in boardrooms far away, unease spread. Western diplomats whispered words like instability and populism. Papers in Paris called it a dangerous revival of ideological nationalism. Because what they feared most wasn't violence, it was belief. The people of Burkina Faso weren't asking for loans. They were reclaiming their dignity. And dignity cannot be sanctioned. The next morning, hundreds of Afro descendants walked through the National Museum of Resistance. They placed flowers beneath portraits of Thomas Sankara, the man who once renamed the country Burkina Faso, land of upright people. Songs were sung. Prayers were whispered. The connection between past and present, between Sankara and Traore, between Mandela and Zuma became visible, tangible, alive. Outside, a new generation of Burkinab youth filled the streets, holding banners that read, "Our future, our hands." They weren't protesting. They were proclaiming. Because courage, once awakened, refuses to sleep. But courage has a cost, and the world was watching. Neighboring governments grew uneasy. The language of sovereignty was spreading too fast to contain. Mali and Niger had already broken away. Others were now reconsidering. The Sahel alliance, dismissed at first as symbolic, was hardening into something real. Something the West could no longer quietly control. By the end of that week, Africa for Africans was printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, shouted in classrooms. What began as rebellion now felt like renewal, not anger awakening. In Wagadugu, murals of Ibrahim Traoré began to appear overnight. One showed him holding a torch, lighting the faces of miners, farmers, and soldiers beneath. Beneath it, painted words. "We are no one's colony." It wasn't propaganda. It was faith in color. The kind of faith you can't manufacture, only inspire. Inside the capital, the government moved quickly. Foreign mining contracts were renegotiated. Gold refining was nationalized. Revenue redirected into rural electrification, education, and healthcare. Revolution had found its blueprint. But revolutions invite resistance. Western investors froze projects. The IMF delayed restructuring talks. Rumors spread of cyber attacks and covert campaigns to discredit the government. Yet the harder the pressure grew, the stronger the people stood. Because once a nation rediscovers its worth, fear loses its voice. In Mali, soldiers marched with flags of the Sahel Alliance. In Senegal, students demanded sovereignty over foreign military bases. In Guinea, posters of Traoré appeared beside Sankara's, the caption, The spirit has returned. What began as one nation's defiance was becoming a continental contagion of courage. Burkina Faso's classrooms also changed. New textbooks told the stories once erased of the Mau Mau in Kenya, the struggle in Angola, the freedom marches of Ghana. Children now learned that history wasn't something written about them, but by them. A teacher told a reporter, "For the first time, our children are proud to say where they come from. That pride is worth more than any loan. But even pride must be protected." Reports surfaced of extremist groups exploiting the chaos. The Sahel nations responded together, forming a joint defense pact. They called it not an army, but a shield of dignity. To the West, this looked like militarization. But to those who built it, it was insurance against manipulation. And quietly, the center of African politics began to shift. No longer dictated from embassies or banks. Now, it pulsed from Wagadugu, raw, unapologetic, alive. A journalist once wrote, "Burkina Faso is a small nation casting a long shadow. After Zuma's visit, that shadow grew, stretching across borders and screens. Some in the West saw danger. Others saw destiny. Because for the first time in a long time, Africa wasn't asking for attention. She was commanding it." In the United States, talk shows debated. Was Ibrahim Traoré a patriot or a puppet? On campuses, students called him the embodiment of Africa's unfinished liberation. The CIA labeled it a narrative revolution. But in small cafes in Atlanta and Detroit, older black veterans whispered something simpler. "He reminds me of Malcolm, but this time he's governing." The symbolism was unstoppable. The freedom fighter of yesterday beside the revolutionary of today, standing on the same red soil, speaking the same ancient truth. Africa belongs to Africans. In Europe, boardrooms trembled. French media called it Sankarism reborn. The Financial Times warned of sovereign contagion, but underneath the fear was respect. Because for the first time in decades, Africa was not burning. She was building. In early 2025, the Sahel Alliance unveiled a joint economic charter, shared energy grids, gold reserves, border security, and education initiatives. Decisions once made in Paris or Washington were now being signed in Wagadugu, Bamako, and Niamey. For the first time, West Africa was deciding for West Africa. And then, another message to the diaspora. "Come home," said Traore. "Bring your skills, your faith, your fire." Flights from Brazil, Jamaica, and America began to land, bringing teachers, doctors, engineers. A movement born online was now arriving on runways. Universities opened, teaching Pan-African governance, renewable energy, and indigenous philosophy. What was once a dream had become policy visible, measurable, alive. But dreams draw enemies. Economic pressure mounted. Cyber attacks intensified. And still, when a journalist asked Traoré if he feared retaliation, he smiled and said, "They told us independence would bring chaos, but maybe what they fear most is our order." When Zuma's plane lifted from Ouagadougou that final evening, the city shimmered under the Sahel sun, a golden web of dust and hope. To outsiders, his visit had been diplomatic theater. To those who witnessed it, it was resurrection. Because Africa has not been silent. She was listening, learning, waiting. And now she is speaking again, not as an echo, but as thunder. So if you believe that Africa's story is not finished, stay with us. History is not a textbook. It is unfolding right now, in real time, under the burning skies of the Sahel. Subscribe, share, stand witness. Because this is not politics. This is resurrection. This is Africa remembering her name.